Good afternoon, secular fam, and I'm so happy to join you all today and enjoy the fellowship as the absolute worst people and dumbest people in the world drive us all into involuntary chaos in order to protect wealthy criminals. Yeah. So, anyway, on a more positive note, this past weekend, Secular AZ was in Tucson for their annual Peace Fair. First time for me being there. Absolutely loved it. Super good time. Really great organization. So, hopefully, we'll be able to bring some of those organizations to a Friday webinar. And we'll actually be back in Tucson next weekend for the annual Tucson Festival of Books, one of my all-time favorite events in Arizona. And I can't wait to be in Pima County. Next week, we welcome back Tia Levings to discuss her new book, I Belong to Me, A Survivor's Guide to Recovery and Hope After Religious Trauma. So today's speaker is so timely because we are speaking with Krispin Mayfield. He is a licensed professional counselor in Portland, Oregon. He specializes in treating religious trauma and developmental trauma. He and his partner, D.L. Mayfield, have been writing about and analyzing Christian nationalism for over a decade. The Mayfields currently publish regular articles about religious authoritarianism on Substack at strongwilled.substack.com. Um, so quite the bio. And if there's anything I missed, please add it. But when you say, I have a quick question already. When you
Yeah.
say developmental trauma, are you talking about like ACEs, like the childhood trauma?
Yeah, we'll actually talk about that today because looking at like different developmental periods, I think purity culture is a really good example of that. Where you have a developmental period where you're developing your sexuality and gender, and during that very kind of like sensitive period, that is targeted and creates some developmental delays. So but developmental trauma can also be another word for complex CPT or complex PTSD or CPTSD as well. So,
Hmm.
yeah.
Well, I didn't mean to steal your thunder and asking you to divide something too quickly. So I am just going to turn it over to you. And folks, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and I will monitor the chat. We'll save the questions for the end. So take it away, Crispin. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's funny that you ask, like, what else might I want to mention? I left Christianity about 2 or 3 years ago. And so I was in progressive spaces for several years. Kind of trying to like fight within the inside and change things from the inside. So it's funny because I have a book out there about attachment and faith. And it's very Christian. So there's sort of this like, yes, you could go into my back catalog. But I will say, a lot of the stuff that my partner and I have been doing for the last 10, 15 years has constantly been critical of Christian nationalism, really before we were even really using that term. So I did want to, yeah, show this picture of my partner because we are life partners. We've been married for almost 20 years, but also professional partners. We have a podcast together, and they have really done a lot of the history in this. So I want to make sure to give them credit for that. So, yeah. So I wanted to talk about religious authoritarian parenting today, which is an approach to parenting that prioritizes obedience over authority, like over everything else. So basically, instead of empathy or curiosity or emotional intelligence, it's just really important to focus on obedience. Um, and really, what this looks like is um, yeah, really, really young, starting with spanking kids, telling them, I'm doing this to make sure you always obey because God wants us to obey every authority in our lives, like a pastor, the conservative president, if there's a conservative president, your husband, if you're a woman, the police, your employer, etc. So this really is like the main goal of parenting to make sure that kids automatically obey. And it wasn't just a philosophy, it was a political strategy. So if kids would obey their conservative parents and grow up to be conservative voters, then conservatives would be able to consolidate power in the US and move towards a religious authoritarian state, which maybe seems to have worked. So, um, but the kind of the main promoter of this is James Dobson. So let's talk for a minute. And you might know who James Dobson is. If not, there's like a lot of resources out there, and his career, unfortunately, is just so influential that there's just so many different aspects to it. What I'm going to focus on today is how he shifted parenting within evangelical communities. But I do want to give just kind of a brief snapshot. So, um, he is a psychologist. He graduated from the University of Southern California.
Real quick, Crispin,
Yeah.
were you going to be showing a slideshow? It's because I feel like
Yes.
you're talking like you're showing a slideshow, so I just want to make sure because I'm waiting to see the picture of your partner.
Yes. Okay. There we
Sorry,
go.
sorry. Go ahead and share your screen.
Yes. There we go. Sorry about that. I'm so glad that you interrupted me. Um, this is my partner. They're great, and we have a lot of fun together. Um, and let's see. Yeah, you didn't miss much. Here's a picture of James Dobson. Um, so yeah, I'm just gonna go through this. He was a psychologist. He actually passed this last summer, which I keep on like referring to him in present tense because we've been talking about him for several years. Um, but he actually graduated from the University of Southern California. He founded the Focus on the Family organization, which boasted 200 million listeners to his radio program, just had this huge influence. And he created a media publishing empire of Christian books, movies, magazines, and radio shows for kids. Um, the New York Times called him one of the nation's most influential evangelical leader in 2005. He also founded the Family Research Council, known for lobbying against embryonic stem cell research, abortion, divorce, and LGBTQIA plus rights. And also I initially was going to write that he was a threatener of presidents, but I think it's more accurate to say influencer. In uh, the late 70s, early 80s, Dobson, like Jimmy Carter had this White House Conference of Families. Dobson wasn't invited. He was upset about that and asked his listeners to write in. They wrote in like 80,000 letters to the White House asking for him to be invited. In 2005, um, he wrote this letter to Bush saying if Bush didn't appoint enough conservative judges, he threatened to influence his listeners to not vote for Republicans in the future. So he's really had this like influential presence um, over U.S. presidents, but has never been like never run for office or anything. He really liked to kind of pull the strings from behind. It's really worth mentioning where Dobson started. He started with Paul Popenoe. Paul Popenoe was Dobson's mentor for the first few years of Dobson's career and wrote the original foreword to Dobson's book, Dare to Discipline. Popenoe also wrote a book about 30 years earlier. He wrote The Sterilization for Human Betterment, which the Nazis used to for their strategies of eugenics. So this is Dobson's Nazi related history. Um, Later, Popenoe shifted to positive eugenics. So basically, the idea of like, how can we get white women to stay married to white men in order to further the white race. He's also considered the founder of modern couples therapy. As a couples therapist and a former evangelical, I'm like, I have a lot to grapple with his legacy. Because basically he was just like, yeah, how do we make sure that white families stay together to increase the white race? Dobson worked under him for the first several years of his career, and as I mentioned, Popenoe wrote the foreword to Dobson's first book, Dare to Discipline. So this is the first cover. This came out in 1969 or 70. Um, so yeah, basically, Dobson, this book, Dare to Discipline, was the start of the religious authoritarian parenting movement. And that was a movement, well, basically, the movement of the religious authoritarian parenting was a reactionary movement. Basically, in the 1960s, there was this fight for women's rights, protest against Vietnam, the civil rights movement, and conservatives got really nervous about losing the power that they had. So they were like, okay, like what can we do about this? Let's start parenting differently. And they were really blaming modern parenting methods on these, like the civil rights movement. So this man here is L. Nelson Bell. He's the father-in-law of Billy Graham, and he wrote something for Christianity Today in 1968. I know you can't see the text, but like I said, my partner is really into the history, and they've just like tracked down all these cool old artifacts. So, but a snapshot of this is Bell says America is suffering from a generation of parents who, by not requiring obedience from children, produce teenagers and young adults with little respect for either God or man. These undisciplined young people are proving themselves a disruptive force on many school campuses, and they're a source of embarrassment and great concern to the nation. Although they're only a small minority, they're jeopardizing the entire structure of society. So just this idea of like it's because like the reason that we're seeing the civil rights movement, that we're seeing women get more rights, that people are protesting Vietnam is because parents haven't been disciplining their kids enough. Dobson said something similar. He says during the 1950s, we saw the predominance of a happy parenting theory called permissive democracy. The philosophy minimized parental obligations to control their children, in some cases, making mom and dad feel that all forms of punishment were harmful and unfair. Dobson then says, is it merely coincidental that the generation raised during this era has grown up to challenge every form of authority that confronts it? I think not. So they're building this idea of really the reason that the civil rights movement is happening is because parents haven't disciplined their kids well enough. So they're like, all right, well, let's change that. So he launches this parenting program. Again, this book, Dare to Discipline. Um, and really, like, I think it's good to talk about like what were the goals of this parenting plan? What were the goals of of religious authoritarian parenting? So we've looked at like lots of books. We're not just looking at Dare to Discipline. We've read like this. We have like two shelves behind us of all the books that we got from the mostly 80s and 90s for parenting that we've analyzed and found that these are kind of the commonalities. So for one, unquestioning obedience to God ordained authorities. So the whole goal was to create kids that would just automatically obey. And in the therapy world, a lot of times we call this fawning, where you feel like I just got to automatically obey. I don't think twice about like, what do I want? What do I need? Might I, want something different? Just automatically submit. Of course, again, that's to God ordained authorities. So, if you have like a liberal president, that doesn't count. But if it's God ordained. The second goal is acceptance of hierarchical roles. So really, the idea is to try to raise kids that will grow up to be, um, a wife or a husband, to, the opposite gender. Um, to obey their religious leaders, to obey their government leaders, to continue to show up to church. Really, just this, there's this hierarchical system, and your goal as a parent is to make sure that your kids grow up to basically just kind of like replicate you. Acceptance and replication of political values. So again, that goal is like if you can really raise your kids in this strict way, they will grow up to have the same political values, usually including homophobia, patriarchy, and misogyny, and other values that marginalize certain groups. So really the idea was like, yeah, we can, if we raise our kids this way, they'll just see the world exactly the same as we do, and we will consolidate political power that way. Um, Acceptance of lifelong parental influence. So some of these authors were, saying if you raise your kids this way, um, you have a right to always have authority over them. So even as adults, you get to kind of decide what's okay and not okay, etc. Dobson wasn't that intense, but he was like, if you discipline your kids strictly, you'll grow up and they will always defer to your opinion and, think that you're so wise and want to just do everything that you think that they should do. Um, so those are the four goals. So let's talk about how it works. So basically this is around corporal punishment, and corporal punishment obviously has been around forever, but Dobson rebranded it, tying it to religion. So we'll talk about that for a minute. So the first thing is, the first step for parents would be let your children know why you're spanking them and tie it to your devotion to God or the Bible. So this looks like something where you say, I have to spank you because of your disobedience against me, which is disobedience against God, and I'm showing you my faith through spanking you. So you really make it a religious ritual in this way. It's not just, not that I want to like downplay just corporal punishment, but it takes corporal punishment, which research has shown is harmful to kids, and puts it in this religious ritual framework. The second step would be make sure that the child knows they've sinned, and that the appropriate way to atone for sin is punishment. And I would add here, like, it's not just sin, it's usually disobedience. So really, you're tying disobedience to an authority to the experience of pain. Number three is make sure that you inflict pain, but in a calm and rational manner. So they were really big into if you don't fly off the handle, if you do it in a calm way, it's not harmful, which isn't what research shows. Um, but yeah, that was one of the steps, was like to be very calm about it, which for kids is really confusing because it's like you're calm, but this is gonna hurt. And then the fourth piece was end the ritual with forgiveness and atonement. So you spank the kid, and then you talk through again, like, this is because I love you. This is because I want you to learn to obey God. The child is expected to hug the parent at the end and maybe even say thank you for spanking me to teach me about God. And this, starts in young childhood. Um, there's this scholar, Susan Ridgely. She did research about families that followed focus on the family's parenting um, advice, and she um, says spanking is moved from a disciplinary technique to a symbolic religious practice that embodies their commitments to parental authority, traditional families, and intergenerational connections. What matters then is not the physical practice of spanking occurs, but these families embrace a corporal punishment based philosophy of discipline. making this choice positions them in opposition to what they perceive to be an undisciplined liberal mainstream society in which the lack of submission to authority has led to the destruction of the family. And what I think is actually most powerful in this quote is actually just the title of her journal article, When Pain Becomes Symbolic of Commitment. So basically, parents were told, if you really care about God, if you really want to be a good Christian, you will spank your kids. And this, just to give some context, this was, I think, really at its height in the 1990s. 42% of people in the US identified as born again. So, this has a huge impact on society. And while evangelicals have many like theological disagreements, they generally all accepted that this form of corporal punishment in parenting was the right way. And it wasn't limited to evangelical communities either. A lot of conservative Catholic and conservative mainline communities also read Dobson. So he didn't talk a lot about theology, but he kind of claimed like this is the biblical way of doing it. So in the I want to I mean, this hopefully gives just a picture of kind of this religious authoritarian parenting movement and the history of it. Again, props to my partner DL for doing a lot of the research about the historical context. Um, I want to take just a couple more minutes and talk about what are those developmental impacts. So, um, I've used Erik Erikson's framework. He was a developmental psychologist. He looked at different phases in a kid's life. And I'm actually writing a book looking at all the different phases and how that shows up with religious indoctrination. But I wanted to talk about two particular ones today because they're the two that Dobson really targeted. So the first was toddlerhood. Um, and Dobson says the toddler years are critical to a child's future attitude towards authority. He's totally correct on that. The toddler years are important. Um, and during this time when 2-year-olds are starting to think about this is Erickson's term is autonomy versus shame and self-doubt. So does the 2-year-old feel like I can make my own decisions? I can decide things for myself, of course, within the limits of, you're not letting your kid run across the street and you have to take baths, but like that child really needs an experience sometimes of saying no to parents, to kind of knowing like I'm my own person. But if they grow up in an environment where that's not honored, where they're always expected to just automatically obey, it creates shame and self-doubt. And that's kind of what Dobson was shooting for. I mean, he was a child psychologist, and he knew that if you start really young, that it will shape the way that a child approaches the world, right? It's not safe to make my own decisions, to disobey authority, to talk back, all those things that we need to develop at some point. So, um, the other season was the teenage years, and I grew up evangelical, so and I remember being a teenager. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what this was like for me. The teenage years are another time where you build autonomy, right? You kind of start to separate from your family and you start asking like, who am I in the world? What do I want? What are my values, etc. Um, and there's rebellion, there's finding an identity. And Dobson, along with kind of the whole like evangelical media market, it wasn't just Dobson, created this experience for teenagers where they felt like they were rebelling from their parents while being just continually fed the same exact like political values. So I've in this picture, this is just a few of the like uh, books and music that was, supposedly cool. And actually, I wanted to show this example. This was one of my favorite albums when I was a teenager. It is death metal. So just imagine like droning drums and just like this, like, deep screaming. But really, it's all about like we need to obey God. Those that don't obey God are going to suffer forever, like in the pits of hell. Like it, it felt so cool and like I was rebelling and like creating my own identity. Um, but in reality, it was just the same exact stuff that my parents believed, just sort of like with a different aesthetic. Um, so I like to think about this as like really an illusion of choice during this time where teens are trying to figure out what is my identity. And Erickson again calls this identity versus confusion. So do you get a sense of like this is who I am and these are my values, or do you feel like I have to take on my parents or just continue what I've been given? Here's another example. This is from Focus on the Family's Teen Boys magazine. Um, and they did this article about these two boys that were kind of rebelling against culture and their cultural expectations by volunteering for conservative Republican politicians. And so it's just this culture that I grew up in is sort of given this idea of like, yeah, you can rebel. You can rebel by adopting the same exact values that your parents have, but we're just going to kind of make it feel different for you. Um, and what's interesting is there's a term for this. It's called foreclosure or identity foreclosure, where you don't get that chance to explore what are my values, what's my identity. Um, and so what they found is that those that don't that foreclose too quickly or prematurely just like take on their parents' values. They did these experiments basically where they measured who and how far someone would go to obey authority if it meant harming an innocent person. You can look up the study for like the specifics, but they found that people that didn't get that chance to develop their own values separate from their parents were just so much more likely to harm innocent people if it meant obeying authority. And I think that just like has huge implications for this whole parental movement, like they really were, they were like, all right, let's raise kids in a way that they don't really think about who it might harm. They're just like, well, what's the authority? We need to do what the authority says. Another implication is that there's research, I've put some articles up here that shows that when kids are raised with these authoritarian parenting methods, they tend to take on authoritarian political beliefs. So, yeah, it's just really interesting to think about the Dobson starting in the 70s and 80s, 90s. Pushing this authoritarian parenting and where we are now, unfortunately. And then looking at kind of, I work as a therapist. My partner and I do writing and podcasting. Um, and there are like just so many ways that we're fighting against religious authoritarian parenting. But one of the big things is helping people see through the religious programming. So a lot of times people are in communities or families that kind of say, well, we're good people because we follow the Bible. And the fact that we want to oppress marginalized groups, well, you need to respect that because we're just, trying to be spiritually good people. And so really helping people recognize like you're allowed to question that, you're allowed to push back on that, and see that with clarity. Building autonomy, so just helping people start to make decisions for themselves, and then supporting people in building the lives that they want to live. So some of the, I generally think that queerness is a huge threat to religious authoritarianism. And so the more that people can live and build communities where they can be their real selves instead of, Dobson talked all the time about he was aware of queerness and he really believed that parents needed to raise their kids in a way so that they wouldn't end up queer. He didn't even believe like everybody's straight. He was like, there are queer people and we need to like fight against that. And so as part of my work, part of my work with my partner together. We're just trying to support people and showing up in whatever way feels good to them in their world and building communities around that. So, yeah.
Right on. Wow. Okay, there's a lot that's swimming through my head right now. You could probably stop sharing your
Oh,
screen.
yeah.
Let's see. Let me see what the first question was, whether you have a private practice, and then there was another question in the chat asking if you are part of the secular therapists organization.
I'm
So,
aware of it. I haven't signed up yet. So, but yeah, I it's really great and it's a place that I like to send people to. So, I think that's really great. And yeah, I have a private practice. I only see people in Oregon because that's my license, but yeah, I really like enjoying survivors of religious trauma.
well, it sounds like people are very much ready to refer people to you. So I think that so far it's been a very positive reaction, if not some, really disturbing. Um,
Yeah.
just a few things that I wrote down while you're speaking. I worked in education, and there was a brief moment here where we had this county superintendent who was actually a Republican, but was a lifelong educator. And I did this fellowship while he was still in office, and he had a whole thing about opportunity youth and childhood trauma. And he had these really amazing trainings where you could learn about ACEs, and
Mm-hmm.
resiliency, and just like how to
Hmm.
support in the classroom. And I remember in one of those trainings, one of the trainers said, like a lot of mental health experts agree that we could probably condense the DSM into a pamphlet because just about everything is related to childhood trauma. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, but you talked a little bit too about developmental trauma. So I want to, like, it's not just childhood trauma for these kids, right? Whose parents, followed
Hmm.
Dare to Discipline to the letter. It's not just that when they're infants, it follows them throughout their whole entire lives. I don't
Hmm.
I don't know if
Yeah.
there's a question there, but it just
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. And there is, I mean, I just talked about two different developmental periods, but kind of throughout. Lately I've been thinking a lot about those later elementary years, kind of fourth through sixth grade, and where you start to really learn some important information about the world. Um, and the way that that's often limited in religious communities. So, like for example, um, I had dinosaur books, but my parents would white out the number of years ago that the dinosaurs lived.
I've actually heard stories like that before. It's
Hmm. But then
wild.
also thinking about like young adulthood, like in 20, like kind of ages 20 to 30, and how a lot of times these families can be really enmeshed and continue to have impact, not for everyone, but sometimes there's that piece too where like I hear stories all the time about I wanted to move to another city when I was 24. Me and my husband decided we wanted to move, and then my parents told us not to, and that they had authority over us.
Yeah, I don't I mean T11's is going to be here next week, and
Uh-huh.
she's got a similar story, but like I can't remember there was another author where it wasn't like that kind of overt, real abuse, but it was like control,
Yeah.
and I remember
Mhm.
reading her book and her being like, maybe. I remember reading her book though and being like, wow, she was like, I can leave. Like, I don't have
Mhm.
to live at home anymore. I
Mhm.
remember she taught piano lessons, like whatever she could do to get herself out
Mhm.
of the house, and her dad just never approving, even if it was from like the
Mhm.
right sect of Christianity or whatever. She just could never leave,
Uh-huh.
and it was like, I don't know, she's 24, 26. She's like,
Right.
I can just leave.
Mhm.
It's
Right.
like, for somebody who wasn't brought up that way, it's just
Mhm.
like such a crazy thing.
Right.
There's a
Mhm.
couple questions here specifically about you.
Yeah.
And so John is asking, how long or how did you stay Christian for so long? What tipped the balance, and how do you identify now?
Yeah. How did I stay a Christian for so long? Um, in a lot of ways, like I was able to find a Christianity that worked in a lot of ways. Like I was going to a church that had an out trans pastor, so if that gives you an idea of kind of like um the place I was in, what tipped the scales for me was I spent several years wrestling with hell, the idea of hell, and a lot of shame. And I wrote a book that I mentioned earlier, Attached to God. And I wrote that book and I kind of like came out with this like better, like I'd done all this like psychological and theological research and was like, okay, I think this is it. I think this is a better form of Christianity. And then I was like, oh, I don't really like, I kind of worked through all that and I don't really need it. And I don't really need, I think I spent so much of my life trying to feel like God liked me.
Mm,
And there's just like a lot of shame there because you get that shame in religious spaces of like, yeah, God loves you, but he always wishes you were like a little bit better. And I got to this place where I was like, oh, like I really do feel like God likes me. And then I was like, wait a minute, I don't think that I need someone outside of myself to tell me that I'm okay.
mhm.
So that was kind of the shift. So
A couple of people are asking if you still have a relationship with your parents.
yeah, this is something that comes up a lot, and something that I navigate through with a lot of clients. And what's kind of interesting for me is I've been no contact with my parents for 10 years now, since 2016.
Mhm,
But for reasons that are related and not related to like kind of the religion and like politics thing. So um, there was um, sexual abuse that occurred in my family. As a was a therapist and someone who cares about people that are abused, spoke up. And my parents continually were like, "You're just you need to be more forgiving. You need to be a better Christian. You need to stop making waves, etc." And it actually ended up that in retaliation for reporting, somebody filed a complaint against my license. My lawyer was like, you need to stop talking to your parents, at least for a time, because this is like actually like, threatening your livelihood. And so that was on the tail of like 10 years of kind of trying to figure some stuff out with them. But what's interesting about that is like that was 2016. So as so many of my peers have seen their parents kind of like get behind Trump and they're like, I was no contact before that happened. That being said, I know that they are uh yeah, very Trumpy right now, or at least in that camp. And so because
mhm,
I hear things through family members. So
mhm.
yeah. I think
Have
it's a
you? Yeah.
really big, sorry, but
No,
I
go
think it's
ahead.
a really big question that so many people are struggling through right now. Like how do I keep a relationship with my parents that are supporting this administration? And it's a really big question, and I think it's different for different people, but yeah.
Mhm, mhm. So I'm curious because because there's a question in here, or more of a statement. I see a connection between this belief in total obedience to the authority figure, usually dad, and sexual abuse of children. And now we're seeing that Jeffrey
Hmm.
Epstein was recommending Dr. James Dobson book
Hmm.
all the time. So have you
Hmm.
looked into that at all? Because
Yes,
I
actually,
can't
yeah.
get off the Epstein files train because I
Yeah.
see it so all of it's just so
Hmm.
connected. So I want to hear
Yeah.
your thoughts.
No, I
Yeah.
I know that a few folks have like did that research. My partner was kind of on the front end of like as soon as it dropped, did that research, found out about it, and we something that I didn't even cover today. We've done a series called Purity Culture is Pedophile Culture. Because the other thing about reading all of these books, these parenting books, is we were noticing themes that were just like really unsettling. Um, about the way that these men would often write about girls. And so, yeah. So if you, I know that the link for our Substack is there. We have a 5-part series looking into that, and tied to that is Dobson was on. I mean, there's just so much history
The
there. He was
the
on the Mies.
pornography. Oh, I
Yes,
thought
he
you
was
were
on the Mies Commission. Uh-huh. Yes. So, and if you want to know, like, um, yeah, like we have our podcast. My partner did like two parts that was like kind of all of them brain dumping all of the like history of Dobson. But yeah, in the 80s, he was on the commission, a federal commission for pornography. And there's, I mean, I don't even want to say that much because a lot of it is like triggering, sort of. It's
yeah.
really intense stuff, but like him viewing a lot of CSAM and then telling other pastors like you need to find out about this yourself firsthand. You should be looking at CSAM. Like it, yeah, is horrific.
Yeah, no, and I personally am just like not I was
Yeah.
surprised but not at all surprised. It was
Right.
weird.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it
Mm-hmm.
is too much. Everything right now is so triggering. If you
Mm-hmm.
know, are a survivor, ever just watching the
Right.
absolute, not even just indifference, but just disdain,
Mm-hmm.
dismissive attitudes. Like,
Right.
how could we possibly believe this is true? Oh, I don't know. We might just listen to the victims, maybe,
Mm-hmm. Right.
but
Exactly. Yeah,
given the
and
fact
that's, I
that,
mean, that
yeah.
that's the experience of so many, myself included, but so many people that I work with, which is like, it was like growing up indoctrinated. It took so much to like finally leave, and then you leave, and you're like, all right, I'm done with religious authoritarians, and then you're like, just kidding. Like now I live in a country. I mean, it's always been there, but it's been really hard for people that are like, I just want to. I grew up with this. I just want to be done with it.
hmm Here's another great question that ties into all of this, because I've been thinking about this more and more too. Do you see the concern with authoritative control in homeschooling?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think that's just like um really common in especially religious homeschooling communities. And I mean it just really works to isolate people. And my partner, if you go on our podcast and go back I don't know, a couple dozen episodes. There's one called DL's Story. They grew up homeschooled, and so they talk about what that's like. Because yeah, their dad was a pastor, and they were homeschooled. So it's like the only community that they had was their church community, which was where their dad was pastor. So you just don't, you don't. I went to public school, and it's still, I was really taught to filter any information I got through my like evangelical lens, but I was glad that I had an experience that wasn't quite so isolated. So
hmm Another thing that you made me think of as well was like these. You talked about the '90s being like that kind of, there was a born again movement was really
hmm
cooking. And
hmm
I've watched a lot of those teen camp documentaries
oh
too,
hmm
and the
hmm
almost all of them, you come to find out who started this. Oh, it was some like elder in the Mormon church, or it was some like,
hmm hmm
author of all these like crazy Christian books. So
hmm
again, I don't know if there's a question in there, but it's just like another like that
right.
developmental kind of abuse where, oh, you're a teenager and you're exerting your independence here, and we're not going to let you
hmm
do that.
right.
To the
And I
point of
think
like,
that it's,
yeah.
yeah, I think it's something that is, I think as a culture, we just like haven't recognized how common this is. So, and it's interesting, like my partner and I, like we like watching Dropout, which is this YouTube channel with a bunch of comedians. And it's funny because everybody like plays it off cool, like, yeah, I'm just like, they don't really talk about their background, but then you'll hear things like they grew up in this same way. And so many people do. In fact, that was also like one of my experiences as a therapist. Like, I worked with so many queer people that are like, I feel like an imposter. I grew up in the Bible Belt, or I grew up homeschooled, and I'm in this queer community, and everyone seems like they don't know anything about what it's like to grow up Christian. And I'm like, no, they do. It's just nobody nobody's talking about it.
All right, exactly.
Yeah.
So, Trump has recently said now, I think, well, first of all, he says a lot of stuff.
Hmm.
and he puts out a bunch of executive orders, so like nothing's law until it's law or whatever. But he's saying now that he's going to bring back conversion therapy to, I believe it was prisons and detention centers.
Mm.
Can did James Dobson have a hand at conversion therapy?
Yeah, he what oh gosh, see this is where my partner would be great at this, but he started one of his, I don't know if it's the Family Research Council, but one of his organizations, he was on the board with a guy who started conversion therapy. And yeah, there's a lot. And he and Focus on the Family had gosh, I forget what the organization was called, but they had a conversion therapy organization. Yeah, I don't know what it was called. Something similar. It wasn't Exodus International, that was another one, but something similar.
Yeah, Exodus International. I've definitely heard of that.
Mhm.
It may
Yeah.
have been, there was that Surviving Mormonism docuseries that was on
Mhm.
recently, and I wonder if maybe that's where it was from. But
Yeah.
here's a question coming from Jay. Is the Christian authoritarian parental movement unique to the United States?
Hmm. We do know that like Dobson's influence was did end up being really global, and we hear from people in like Australia and New Zealand that are like, "Oh yeah, this was like, huge in our church." And but beyond that, like, and if I'm thinking about like non-Western cultures, I'm just not really sure. Um, that being said, I should mention that there's also, I mean, there's so much history that I just talked about this piece. If you want to dive into it, there is uh, history around, this isn't exactly what you asked, but Dobson um, uh, did work in Russia that seems to have some direct implications for getting Putin into power. So that's a rabbit trail if you ever want to go down that as well. So,
No shortage of rabbit
mhm.
trails these days. So here's one coming from Erica. And Erica, thanks for always showing up at the Capitol. I saw you in the Education Committee hearing, and it's not fun to do that. Erica says, so much of what he describes is so similar to my parents when I grew up in the 60s and 70s, went no contact in 87. However, I never got the sense that their attitudes came out of some organized philosophical movement, but rather a
Mhm.
repeating of the family culture that they came out of. How much of Dobson's parenting philosophy was created in pursuit of some cultural goal, and how much of it was the rationalization of the parenting culture they came out of, convincing himself that his culture was by definition right?
I think both I think that yeah, I mean, I think Dobson said, yeah, the way that my dad did it and his dad did it, is the right way because that was the biblical way. And the fact that we're seeing the protests in the 60s is evidence that we're getting away from that. So we need to come back to it. So, yeah, it wasn't new. It wasn't, like I said, it was rebranded, but it was just really him just, yeah, giving that justification for why to do it and hoping that it would have the outcomes of a more hierarchical society.
Well, and I think, my own dad has he actually has a pretty strong disdain for organized religion. He sees it
Mm-hmm.
as a grift, and kind of
Mm-hmm.
always has.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
But growing up, you better believe my dad loved the patriarchy, especially the hierarchical structure at home. He was like, and that was the way of the world. My sisters were born in the
Right.
60s. I was born in 72, but like they both worked the
Mhm.
same factory job. And then my dad would come home and, maybe would play with us for like 30 minutes, but then he would sit on his lazy boy with his newspaper and we all needed to
Mhm.
shut up. Otherwise,
Mhm.
you're going to get a smack. And my
Mhm.
mom was frantically trying to clean up the house, make sure we're doing our
Mhm.
homework, like all that kind of stuff. So,
Right.
my dad, a former lifelong Republican, still registered as one, is, has now since even said to me, like, I bet I could have been nicer to your mom and stuff
Mm,
like that, but
mhm,
like
mhm,
they all grew up watching their dads treat their moms like shit too,
mm,
and
mhm.
whether that came from the Christian patriarchal, structure or just like the American patriarchal structure, it's
Right.
hard to say
Yeah.
which one.
Right. Yeah. And again, I think it's just that, I mean, it wasn't new, but I think that he yeah, trying to like get back to, I mean, it's very, uh, really makes very, analogous to the like Make America Great Again. Like, what are we trying to get back to? Trying to get back to white supremacy hierarchy where men can sit on the lazy boy and women do. I mean, it's almost hilarious if it wasn't like in his Dare to Discipline book, he has this chapter called like A Moment for Mom, and he's like, yeah, like, moms are important too. Like, make sure that she gets an hour to go to the gym um each week. Like,
Right, so she can continue to look good for everybody, right? Like that's the only outlet
mhm.
mom gets,
Right, yeah.
Yeah. It made me think about to um oh shoot, it just completely slipped my mind. But there's another question here. Ron says, I'd love to amplify your message. There's another therapist who does podcasts, Dr. Kirk Honda,
Mm.
Psychology in Seattle, who has a large listener base,
Oh,
that I'd
cool.
love to hear you and him talking about this as he grew up religious and doesn't have too much trauma from it. If you reach
Oh,
out to him and Ron says he
yeah.
can do it too, I'd love to hear two therapists from different perspectives discussing this kind of trauma. Let's just, yeah, load
Uh-huh.
all the
Yeah.
trauma. Let's go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, here's this one's from Michael. Michael's on our board of directors, and he says,
Mm.
is anyone out there doing investigative reporting on this movement and its abuses? Who do you turn to for information and insight?
Um, yeah, there's not a lot. We hope someone will. We've been doing our like little research on Substack, which we have like three book proposals in the works right now. So these will come become books someday. But to give a picture of what it's looked like, my partner has a friend who lives in DC that just went to the National Archives taking pictures of the Meese Commission transcriptions because they're not digitized. Like, yeah, people are not doing this. So, like, we're just, kind of in our side hustle, just doing the research. So, and we've like contacted, yeah, like there are people doing like little parts of the work, but yeah, there really needs to be more investigation.
Alex is asking, do you have any thoughts on a new research into religious trauma syndrome?
Not particularly. I really love Marlene Winnell. And as I'm working on this book right now around like looking at each developmental phase and like how that impacts you if you grew up in a high control religious group. And I'm really like borrowing a lot or like standing on her shoulders of her work that she's done, thinking about this in terms of developmental delays. I think that there is um, really um, when it comes to religious trauma, my hope is that we have more non-religious resources. So, what I notice as a therapist and in this space is that when it comes to like if you Google religious trauma, a lot of the podcasts and research resources that come up are written by Christians, kind of saying, yeah, the church hurt you, but here's a better theology. And my hope is to be shifting more towards one, just more of a clinical focus, but for two, to recognize the Christian bias that shows up even when people are trying to reach out to recover from religious trauma. So,
Mhm. Um, yeah, it makes me think of the book. I'm assuming you probably read it. The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog or a Wolf. I don't know.
oh,
You
uh-huh.
know who I'm talking? Bruce Perry, I think
Yeah.
is the guy's name. But it just makes me think of like how much damage can be done in such a short period of time with these
Mm-hmm.
poor, children who
Right.
are raised this way, and there's so few protections, especially in
Mm-hmm.
a church environment. Again, the
Mm-hmm.
more I look into this and, read more about religious cults and the damage that's done to children, it really breaks my heart. I have
Yeah.
enough childhood trauma just from regular secular parents. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
To add that extra layer, it's just
Yeah.
such a shame. Such a shame. Um,
Right. Because I mean, one thing that that I think about the difference between the two is like when you are um wh when there's not a religious component, you can go through like abuse or trauma, and this is maybe oversimplified. So I want to give, that there's a lot of nuance to this, but a lot of times you can sort of hold your own internal sort of like, I hate this, I don't like this isn't right, that sort of thing. But when you're told God sees your heart, God sees everything that you think, then you really have to, there's this kind of self-policing that happens. And I think that's really impactful.
mm. And those that I know who have survived that kind of religious trauma and or abuse, it leads to so much second guessing, like,
Hmm.
every decision that they make, or just, even though they may be 10 years outside of it, there's that little
Right.
voice if they're making a decision that's like,
Hmm.
you are a
Well,
bad
yeah, and
person.
that's that toddler stage of autonomy. I can make my own decisions versus shame and doubt and self-doubt. Or do I have to doubt myself all the time and I can't trust myself?
Hmm.
And
You
that's
know,
what's wild is it goes back to, yeah, toddlerhood. So,
I have a grandson right now. He'll be 2 in a couple weeks, and
hmm.
he like we have this routine of going to the library, and his new favorite thing is to see how much he can get away with the adults in his life.
Uh-huh.
So we walk out the library, he gives me this little look, and he runs
Uh-huh.
down the sidewalk, and he knows that he's
Yeah.
supposed to stop at the parking lot. And I, think
Hmm.
he's coming back, and then he goes right back in the library and starts zigzagging through like it's his favorite.
Right.
The bookshelves, he thinks
Yeah.
it's the funnest thing ever. And I just approach it, like this is discovery for this kid.
Right.
He's testing the boundaries. And so
Hmm.
I just can't
Right.
imagine like him as a
Right.
baby.
Imagine that 2-year old, but instead of like, hey, like, yeah, and it being interpreted, and Dobson says this over and over. He tells parents you might be tempted to see your kid as just exploring or figuring out the world, but in reality, they are defying your authority. And so he just really discourages them from being empathic towards their kids and thinking like, yeah, this is a developmental stage. And maybe yeah, of course, I don't let my kid run in the street. There are all these limits, but I'm not going to interpret my kid is like breaking the rules as they are defying me as the parent. And it's so personal about me. And it, has these implications for like, are they gonna, um, you know, are they going to obey God and, all the things. So,
James Dobson single-handedly helped an entire wave of therapists build their summer homes because of all the childhood trauma that he's caused throughout his time here on Earth. Um,
right.
Whatever. Anyway, this has been a great conversation. I thank you for the links. I am definitely going to be listening to DL's story or reading DL's story. Is it a podcast
It's a
or
podcast, but we also have
it's
transcripts
a,
up.
it's in
So,
written?
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I just appreciate you. I try to end every we can probably get the email contact information
Yeah.
right there. Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Mhm.
But I wanted to ask you the question that I ask everybody at the end of our webinar, and that is because everything's so crappy right now, what gives you
Mhm.
hope?
Yeah, it's funny. This is something that we often end our podcast episodes with. What gives me hope is just seeing people and the clients that I work with, and a lot of people in our generation and younger, um, really starting to ask like how much do I want to accommodate this like religious authoritarianism and building the resources to stop accommodating it. So, and that means things like, I think a really common thing with clients is like, hey, mom and dad, I want a relationship with you, but I don't want to talk about God. We're not going to talk about God. And parents are like, but that's the most important thing. And it's like, I want a relationship with you, but like these are the terms. And I hope that that sort of thing brings a like a societal shift. So
I
yeah.
sure hope so too. But today was my pleasure. There's a lot of kudos here. Thank you for doing this difficult work. Thank you for being awesome. And really, thank you for joining our little webinar. I appreciate you, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here and glad that y'all are doing what you're doing. So thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend. Take care.